I regret that she chose to hide demons and tried to poison a man of God. They were celebrated as a beacon of faith, a divine couple destined to inspire with their story of love and redemption. He, a charismatic preacher whose sermons shook congregations, and she, a woman saved from the ashes of her troubled past. Together, they seemed invincible, an embodiment of purity and divine purpose. But just 2 days into their honeymoon, in the privacy of a luxury suite, everything unraveled in a way no one could have imagined. A secret, hidden in the shadows, sparked a brutal rage that would leave a trail of blood and devastation. What happens when trust crumbles, when love turns to betrayal, and when faith is twisted into something unrecognizable? When a sacred union becomes a deadly battleground, driven by shame, secrets, and a twisted sense of divine justice? This is the chilling and tragic tale of Reverend Kashad Ellington and Jamron Ketchy Rhodes, a story of salvation turned slaughter. Before we dive into the darkness of this case, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the most shocking true crime stories, stories that will haunt you long after they end. Reverend Kashad Ellington was a man who commanded attention. At 46 years old, he had built a reputation as a fire and brimstone preacher whose sermons echoed through the halls of Greater Deliverance Temple in Florence, South Carolina. His voice boomed with authority, stirring the souls of his congregation as he preached abstinence, purity, and the wrath of a judgmental God. His followers, many of whom had never experienced the kind of power he wielded from the pulpit, adored him. They believed him to be a living vessel of divine truth, the very embodiment of salvation. Yet, behind closed doors, there were whispers. Whispers about his controlling nature, his unrelenting demands for obedience, and his suffocating grip over those closest to him. But in the light of the church, he was the prophet, a spiritual leader destined for greatness. Then there was Jamron Ketchy Rhodes. At 31, she had already lived a lifetime of suffering and survival. A quiet beauty, her brown eyes held stories of pain and resilience that few would ever know. Jamra had endured sexual abuse, struggled with addiction, and faced the harsh realities of incarceration. Her past was a heavy weight she carried daily. But it was inside the walls of Ellington's church that Jamra found the grace of a second chance. Reverend Ellington often spoke of her transformation from the pulpit, using her story as a testament to the power of God's mercy and redemption. To the outside world, Jamra was a symbol of purity, a woman reborn in faith, a living miracle of divine intervention. Her past, though scarred, became part of the narrative Ellington was building, a narrative of salvation that he wore like a badge of honor. The two of them were an inseparable pair, their love seemingly blessed by God himself. Their wedding, a grand affair, was nothing short of spectacular. A gospel-filled celebration, broadcast across social media for the world to see. Their union was hailed as the ultimate proof of God's power to restore and redeem. Their followers flooded the comments with congratulations and praise, applauding the seemingly perfect couple. They were the picture of holiness, a spiritual dynasty on the rise, but behind the carefully curated images and the smiles for the camera, something darker was brewing. The cracks in their carefully constructed facade were there, even if no one could see them yet. The truth, like a shadow lurking in the corners, was waiting, ready to surface and tear apart the lives they had built so meticulously. Beneath Jamra's public transformation lay a deeply personal and painful truth: she was HIV positive. Diagnosed 3 years prior, during her time in recovery from a troubled past that included substance abuse and incarceration, Jamra had struggled with her status in silence. She kept this information hidden, not just from her family, but from the man she was about to marry. Jamra's decision to conceal her diagnosis was driven by fear of rejection, of condemnation, and of losing the new life she had painstakingly built. At the time of her wedding to Reverend Ellington, her HIV status was a secret she had not shared with him, despite their otherwise open relationship. This secret, though hidden behind a smile, weighed heavily on her, as she feared the repercussions it could have on her future with the man she had come to love. Reverend Ellington, for his part, had suspicions that would soon manifest. Known for his strict, controlling demeanor and a demeanor that bordered on possessive, he was not as trusting as he appeared in public. Though his sermons extolled forgiveness and divine grace, his personal life revealed a different side. Ellington, in private conversations with a mistress, revealed his doubts about Jamra's purity. In text messages uncovered during the investigation, Ellington expressed to the mistress that he had a feeling she's tainted and planned to confront her about it, but not before securing the financial gifts bestowed upon them by their church community. The couple had received over $40,000 in wedding blessings from congregants, a significant sum that Ellington had ensured they would receive before addressing his suspicions that Ellington's actions, influenced by control and a need to uphold an image of perfection, set the stage for the unraveling of the marriage. His thoughts and intentions, revealed through recovered messages and his subsequent actions, painted a clear picture of the deeply rooted issues within the relationship, issues that would ultimately lead to an irreversible confrontation. On the second night of their honeymoon, the serene luxury of their Charleston resort suite became the setting for a confrontation that would seal Jamra's fate. Reverend Ellington, having spent the previous day in a state of mounting suspicion, finally confronted his new wife. He had discovered the truth, Jamra's HIV status, through a methodical investigation into her past, including medical records he had somehow acquired. His growing doubts, which had simmered under the surface for months, had now erupted into a full-blown accusation that the intimacy of their honeymoon suite, what was supposed to be a sacred time of love and connection, quickly dissolved into a nightmare. Ellington, with a trembling rage, accused Jamra of hiding the truth from him, accusing her of deceiving a man of God. He confronted her with the damning evidence, his voice shaking with fury. "You've poisoned me," he said, his words venomous, "poisoned my body and my bed." The sanctity of their marriage was shattered in an instant, and the man who had once praised her redemption now saw her only as a source of defilement. Jamra, her heart pounding in her chest, tried to explain, to plead for understanding. She had kept this secret for so long out of fear of rejection, fear of losing the only chance she had ever been given at a new life. But Ellington was beyond reason. His anger was not only personal but deeply rooted in his religious fanaticism, a twisted belief that her status was not just a betrayal of him but an affront to God himself. Her past, once celebrated as a testimony of salvation, now became an accusation he could not forgive. His sense of control, of righteousness, had been shattered, and in its place, a dark rage took over. As the argument escalated, it quickly became violent. The once serene suite, a symbol of their honeymoon bliss, was transformed into a chaotic scene of destruction. Guests in neighboring suites reported hearing the unmistakable sounds of screams, crashing thuds, and the shattering of glass around 1:30 a.m. The commotion was so intense that it could not be ignored, yet no one intervened. Jamra's attempts to plead for mercy, to make him understand the depths of her fear and shame, fell on deaf ears. The man who had once preached forgiveness and love now saw her only as something to be purged, something impure, tainted, and unworthy of his grace. In the midst of the turmoil, Jamra's fate was sealed. What should have been a sacred celebration of love had turned into a brutal confrontation that would lead to her untimely death. The events that unfolded in that honeymoon suite were horrific beyond imagination. What began as a violent argument quickly descended into an incomprehensible display of rage. Ellington, consumed by his twisted sense of justice and fueled by his own self-righteous delusions, erupted into a frenzy. He shattered a mirror, its jagged pieces scattering across the floor like the shattered remnants of what had once been his facade of righteousness. Then, with the brutal force of a man who believed he was enacting divine retribution, he began to beat Jamra with a lamp. The violence was swift and savage. Ellington's blows fractured her skull in 4 distinct places, each strike leaving a trail of blood that marked the once pristine suite. He didn't stop there. In his frenzy, he drove a knife into her abdomen, the blade slicing through her flesh as she writhed in agony. The viciousness of the attack escalated, and in a final act of brutality, Ellington thrust a jagged shard of the broken mirror into her throat, effectively silencing her cries forever. Forensic evidence later revealed the horrific details of her final moments. Despite the overwhelming violence, Jamra had managed to attempt to crawl away, her hands and knees dragging her bloodied body across the floor in a desperate bid for escape. But her efforts were in vain. Her wedding ring finger was severed, a grotesque symbol of the bond that had once seemed sacred between them. In a final act of desecration, Ellington flushed the severed finger down the toilet, as if attempting to erase every trace of the woman he had once vowed to love and protect. The next morning, hotel staff arrived for their routine check, expecting the usual newlywed bliss. What they found was something far more chilling. They walked into the suite to find Ellington sitting calmly on the blood-soaked bed, an eerie stillness surrounding him as he read aloud from the book of Leviticus. His voice, steady and unemotional, echoed through the room, as though he were reciting scripture in some form of twisted ritual. The verse he read was from Leviticus 20:10, "If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death." It was as though, in his delusional mind, this was his justification, his way of rationalizing the brutal act he had just committed. The words of scripture, twisted by his madness, became his shield, his justification for the atrocity he had just perpetrated. When law enforcement arrived, they found him unrepentant, his demeanor cold and calculating. He didn't seem surprised by their presence, nor did he show any emotion as they arrested him. He remained eerily calm, even as the enormity of what he had done began to sink in. In his mind, he had done the work of God, a cleansing act. But to the rest of the world, the horror was incomprehensible. Jamra's life, snuffed out in a moment of uncontrollable rage, became a tragic reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, misplaced faith, and religious extremism. Her family, her friends, and the community that had once seen her as a beacon of hope were left to pick up the pieces, devastated by the brutality of the preacher who had promised to heal souls, but instead, destroyed one. The murder of Jamra Nkechi Road sent shockwaves across the nation, sparking a media firestorm that dominated headlines for weeks. The public's reaction was swift, brutal, and unrelenting. Across news networks, social media platforms, and op-ed columns, the case became a lightning rod for a host of deeply rooted issues: religious hypocrisy, toxic masculinity, and the ongoing stigma surrounding HIV. The image of Reverend Kashad Ellington, once revered as a man of God, was shattered. Instead of being a symbol of faith and salvation, he was now seen as the embodiment of rage, manipulation, and dangerous extremism. Outside the courthouse, protesters rallied, their voices rising in fury as they called for justice. Signs reading "Church is not a weapon and HIV is not a death sentence" were held high, demanding accountability for a man who had weaponized his faith to justify the unthinkable. They marched for Jamra, for the women who had been silenced by the toxic power structures of religious institutions, and for the countless others who suffered in silence due to the stigma of HIV. The case had become more than just a tragic murder, it had become a symbol of the fight against the systems that allowed such cruelty to fester. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution laid bare the true, chilling nature of Ellington's actions. They revealed text messages he had sent to his mistress in the days leading up to the murder, words that dripped with malice and ego. One message, in particular, sent a cold shiver through the courtroom: "If she played me, her blood gone pay for it." These words, stark and cold, exposed the true motive behind the brutal attack. It wasn't a momentary fit of rage inspired by faith or religious zeal, it was premeditated. Ellington had planned to confront Jamra not just for her secret, but for the financial windfall he was determined to secure. Prosecutors argued that Ellington's ego had been bruised by the thought of being deceived by the woman he had married. He had not only felt betrayed by her, but by the prospect of losing control over his carefully curated public image and the $40,000 wedding blessing from his church. In his mind, this betrayal warranted a response far more brutal than anything his religion could offer in terms of forgiveness. The public was appalled. How could a man, so trusted and revered in his community, be capable of such premeditated cruelty? How could someone who had preached salvation, love, and forgiveness turn into a killer who justified his actions with scripture? The case dug into the underbelly of religious institutions, where power and control often went unchecked, and where the notion of divine authority could be manipulated to the most twisted of ends. As the trial continued, the true horror of Ellington's actions became clearer with each new revelation. His twisted motive was not only rooted in his own bruised ego, but in his insatiable thirst for money, power, and control, things he believed were rightfully his, no matter the cost. In the end, Jamra's life had been nothing more than a pawn in his grandiose vision of himself as a divine authority, and she paid the ultimate price for it. The national outcry was deafening, but for the family and loved ones of Jamra, the true horror lay in the betrayal of a man who was supposed to represent the very best of humanity, but instead revealed the darkest parts of himself. The tension in the air was palpable, with every word spoken in that courtroom carrying the weight of public outrage, religious disillusionment, and the quest for justice for Jamra Nkechi Rhodes. For weeks, the prosecution meticulously pieced together the evidence, Ellington's chilling text messages, the forensic reports that revealed the gruesome nature of his crime, and the testimony from witnesses who described the aftermath of the horrific night. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was Ellington himself. Throughout the proceedings, the man who had once stood at the pulpit, preaching salvation and forgiveness, sat in the defendant's chair with an eerie detachment. His demeanor remained cold and unrepentant. Not once did he show any remorse for the brutal murder of his wife, the woman whose life he had destroyed in an act of unimaginable rage. When asked by the defense attorney about his feelings toward the death of Jamra, Ellington's response was chilling in its severity and complete lack of empathy. "I regret that she chose to hide demons and tried to poison a man of God." The words sent a ripple through the courtroom, the coldness of his statement echoing the monster that had emerged from beneath the cloak of scripture he had once worn so proudly. He spoke of his wife as if she were a mere object, something that had wronged him, rather than a person, a victim of his own brutality. His refusal to acknowledge his actions or the gravity of the crime only further solidified the prosecution's argument. This was not a man of faith, but a man who had used religion as a shield for his own twisted desires. The prosecution's strategy was clear: to reveal Ellington for what he truly was, a monster cloaked in scripture. They painted him as someone who had manipulated his position of power, not just in the church, but in his marriage. He had lured Jamra into his world of control and submission, promising her salvation and redemption, only to strip her of her agency once he felt betrayed. His motives were not spiritual or righteous, they were driven by ego, pride, and a lust for control. He had used his position as a preacher to manipulate, to deceive, and ultimately to destroy the woman he claimed to love. As the trial moved forward, it became abundantly clear that Ellington had orchestrated a deliberate, calculated act of violence. The forensic evidence showed that Jamra had been brutally beaten and stabbed with a violent intensity that could only come from someone consumed by a need to punish and dominate. The severing of her wedding ring finger, flushed down the toilet, was a symbolic act of possession, of erasing her from his life in the most permanent of ways. The evidence was irrefutable, and the case against Ellington became stronger with each passing day. The defense, in their attempt to mitigate the severity of Ellington's actions, argued that he had been driven to the brink by the revelation of his wife's HIV status. They painted him as a man who had been betrayed, a man whose trust had been shattered. But these arguments fell flat in the face of the brutal facts. The prosecution countered by reminding the jury that Ellington had never sought help, never tried to understand or support his wife. Instead, he had chosen violence. His response to a deeply personal and painful truth was not compassion, but rage. When it came time for the jury to deliberate, it took them only 3 hours to reach a verdict. The weight of the evidence, coupled with Ellington's chilling indifference throughout the trial, led them to a unanimous decision. Ellington was found guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, aggravated assault, and destruction of evidence. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and sorrow, relief that justice had been served, but sorrow for the life that had been lost and the deep scars left on everyone who had been touched by this horrific crime. The judge sentenced Ellington to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that reflected the brutality of his actions and the total lack of remorse he had shown. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to spread his toxic influence to others. In addition to his life sentence, Ellington was also barred from leading any religious services while incarcerated. His days of preaching and wielding power over others had come to an end. He was to be stripped of the very position he had used to manipulate and control his congregation, to exploit the faith of others for his own gain. The sentence was seen by many as a small measure of justice, but it could never undo the damage Ellington had caused. No prison sentence could bring Jamra back, no punishment could erase the pain of the life she had lived and the way it had been tragically ended. For the family and friends who had been left behind, the trial was a painful, cathartic experience, but it offered them a sliver of peace. knowing that the man who had destroyed their loved one would never again be allowed to harm anyone else. As Ellington was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his crime settled heavily on him. He had been a man who had used the power of faith to control and destroy, and now, that same power had been stripped away from him. Behind the cold steel bars of prison, Ellington would face the consequences of his actions, but for Jamra, there would never be justice. She was gone, a victim of a man who had perverted everything he once claimed to represent, and no verdict could ever bring her back. This case shattered any illusions of holiness that once surrounded Reverend Kashad Ellington and the institution he represented. What was once seen as a symbol of salvation turned out to be a breeding ground for manipulation, control, and destructive power. Jamra Nkechi Rhodes, a woman who had sought refuge in the church and dreamed of a new beginning, was ultimately betrayed by the very institution that promised redemption. She tried to rebuild her life, to love, to heal, to live a life free from the trauma of her past. But instead of finding the grace and compassion she so desperately needed, she was met with violence, cruelty, and an unforgivable betrayal. In the end, it was the very church that claimed to save her that destroyed her. The story of Jamra's death forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the intersections of faith, secrecy, and unchecked power. It exposes the dangers of placing blind trust in figures of authority, especially those who cloak themselves in the guise of righteousness while hiding their darkest impulses. The case also forces us to reckon with the stigma surrounding HIV, particularly in religious spaces where silence often breeds shame and fear. It is a deadly cocktail of shame, secrecy, and power that takes the lives of those too vulnerable to stand against it. Reverend Ellington's actions were undoubtedly rooted in betrayal, but they were also driven by pride, manipulation, and an overwhelming need to assert control over a woman he viewed as property rather than a partner. His self-righteousness blinded him to his own flaws and fueled his destructive behavior. So, the question remains, how do we dismantle the stigma around HIV in religious spaces? How do we ensure that those who seek solace and sanctuary are met with compassion and care, not condemnation? How do we prevent more lives from being destroyed by this toxic combination of faith and fear? If this story shook you, leave a like, and subscribe for more chilling true crime stories that expose the darkest corners of love, control, and fatal secrets. The truth must be known, and the shadows must be brought into the light.